Oh.
Hi, everyone. Can you just in the group chat give me a yes or a thumbs up or a smiley face if you can hear me? Yay. Good deal. All right. So looks like we have, let's see, too many tabs open. I think we've got about 70 people here, and it'll max out at 100. So if you do have some colleagues that are trying to connect and our room fills up, just please remind them that we will be sharing a recording of this following the end of the session. So at any point, if you guys can't hear me, I'm running this session alone. So if you can't hear me, please put it in the chat, and I'm certainly going to be looking at the screen to see if everything's going okay. Okay, so welcome. In these unprecedented times, I'm glad that you were able to carve out a little bit of time to spend learning about copyright. And looking at all of the NC Learn Together sessions that were available, I thought, I hope I can sell this topic well enough for folks to show up, because I'll admit, just looking at the title doesn't necessarily get me too excited. But I hope that you'll find this session has some good information for you, not just for this time when we're talking about remote learning, but just in general, especially when we're talking about this world of digital content and how do we make sure that when we're sharing things online that we're following copyright law. So here we go. We're going to jump in. I shared the link in the chat for the slide deck. So if anyone asks, how about we do some group share? And if you see someone asking in the chat for the link, if one of you will throw it in there as needed, that'd be great. Okay, Christy says, I tell my students when I do copyright lessons, it's the single most boring topic ever. Yeah, I'm gonna try to make it as fun as I can. All right, so someone's asking for the link. So if somebody would please just toss that into the chat, that'd be great. And we'll support each other in this work. Okay. I'm Donna Murray. I recognize some names on the call, so welcome everybody. If you don't know who I am, I'm a consultant at DPI in the Division of Digital Teaching and Learning. So I've got my contact information there. Feel free to reach out to me after the session if you have any questions. My main hat currently has been around digital content, and I've been really involved in all of the work in North Carolina around openly licensed educational resources, OER. So we'll talk about that today too, after we dig into copyright. I also wear a regional hat, and I serve the Northwest region, and I currently serve the West region as well, all of the districts and charter schools there, because we still have a vacancy in the West. So like you, lots of many hats. Just a couple of logistics. There is a link to the attendance form at the end of the session, and I've already shared the link with you to the presentation, but it's also near one of the last slides at the end, so feel free to share that. You will get a CEU certificate emailed in the next week. Please make sure you check the NC Learns Together website to make sure that you understand how that process is working. Basically, when you sign in the attendance form at the end of the session, that time date stamp will indicate to our fearless leaders who put all of this work together to make sure that you get your certificate emailed within the next week. So know that that is available to you. And like I mentioned, and I want everyone to know, we are recording this session, and my plan is to share this with others. So we'll talk about some places that we're going to share this link, and then also, of course, I'll be posting it like on our social media channel for Digital Teaching and Learning. And then the other thing, you see this hashtag down here, connections before content. We're going to be talking about law and copyright, and I'm sure you've already been bombarded with just all things remote learning. But I really encourage you, as you're thinking about remote learning for your students, to take a step back, pace yourself, understand that this is really about making sure our students feel supported and connected with, and that really comes before all of these ideas of how are we going to get the content to them and make sure that we're filling those instructional gaps. This is about connecting with our kids, because this is definitely an unprecedented time for all of us, really. Actually, on a personal note, my daughter, who has a lot of special needs, already has her days and nights flipped. So we are consistently staying up till 5 or 6 in the morning. So working from home remotely is an interesting challenge when it's kind of a 24-hour job. So I know we all have some personal things that we're dealing with in this time, and we recognize our students are facing that too. So just focus on connections before content. That's your takeaway from this slide. Okay, I have to put this disclaimer up because there are copyright lawyers out in the world, and I certainly don't imply that I am one or that I have that depth of knowledge. I do feel like I've done quite a bit of research around copyright, so certainly the information that I share with you today, I feel like I can say with some certainty, but definitely this is not legal advice. So this is my disclaimer. This is for informational purposes only. So we're going to kind of, we're not going to dig too deep today, because I know that your minds are already overwhelmed with kind of all things remote learning and COVID-19. And so we're going to talk about the basics But then we're going to talk about a couple scenarios where we're going to dig in a little bit deeper and kind of put what we learn about copyright law to work. And we're going to try to apply that to some scenarios that you might be considering right now as you're talking about remote learning. Hopper says, can you keep me out of jail? I will try. I will definitely try. Okay, so when we talk about copyright, it's important to know that that's just one piece of intellectual property. And so when we talk about intellectual property, copyright is one of the things under that umbrella, but then there's also things like trademarks and trade secrets, and there's all different kinds of intellectual properties. We're going to dig into copyright specifically. And so we're really focused on those exclusive rights that a creator has when they create something. And so right out of the gate, anybody that creates something is automatically given those exclusive rights. And I love this language that's in copyright law, because the intent, while it's intended to provide some exclusive rights to those who create content, the ultimate goal is really a societal goal. This is about promoting the progress of creativity. And to do that, there's a limited time that authors and inventors actually have those exclusive rights. So it's not, I create something and then forevermore I own the rights to it. It's about, at some point, letting that content go out into the world and be part of society so that folks can take that and build on it and really progress the science and arts. So it's important to know that, because in a minute we're going to talk about that distinct length of time that copyright rights are given. So it does apply to anything that somebody creates that's kind of in a fixated, tangible format. So if I write a blog post online, or if I author a book or a song or a movie, any of those types of things that can be kind of fixated in some sort of tangible format is automatically copyrighted. And it's automatic. So I don't have to register with the Copyright Office. I don't have to put the C with the circle around it. It's automatically given as a content creator. And that's important to know, because if we find some content online and it doesn't have the C with the circle around it, that does not mean that that's up for free grabs and I can do what I want to with it. It does not protect like factual information, but you may say then, well, if it's a nonfiction book and it has facts in it, then how can you copyright it? Because to some degree, the person who has put those facts together has added a level of expression to those facts or ideas. So either by graphics or just by the design and structure of those facts, then it can be copyrighted. So it really is about the expression of those facts. So one of the things to think about is, what are those exclusive rights? And as a content creator, I get to decide if I want to make copies of that or translations of that, or if I want to perform it and communicate it. And this is important, because in a few minutes when we talk about what are the rights of educators with copyrighted content, we have to consider what the exclusive rights are that were automatically granted to content creators. This is interesting. So once upon a time, copyright term was much, much less in the United States than it is right now. Currently, in a lot of parts of the world, it's the life of the author or the copyright owner, plus 50 years after they're gone. In the United States, it's more than that. It's 70 years, and it did not used to be that long. And there's arguments being made that, my goodness, if it's the life of the author plus 70 more years after they're gone, then by the time the content does fall into the public domain and go out to all of society, we've missed like a generation or two of folks being able to take that content and expand on it. And so I love this chart, and I've linked, the attribution link is right below it. This is called the copyright duration and the Mickey Mouse curve. If you know the first animated video from Mickey Mouse was Steamboat Willie. That's Disney. Yeah, you got to be careful with Disney. So Steamboat Willie was just getting ready to fall into the public domain. And for however it happened, the law was actually changed just about the time that Steamboat Willie was about to fall into the public domain. So just about the time that copyright was going to end and those exclusive rights would be gone, the law changed. And it continues, as you notice our little line here, that as that movie is about to fall into the public domain, the law gets changed again. So we call this the Mickey Mouse curve because it seems like there's a lot of lobbying going on to keep the Steamboat Willie from falling into the public domain. Now, we'll see if that happens again. There's a new expiration date coming not too far down the road. So we'll see if that continues. If the Mickey Mouse curve kind of drops off and no one lobbies to get the copyright extension extended even more than 70 years, then you would actually have the right to take any of the content from the Steamboat Willie video and use it however you want, because it would be in the public domain. Now, I feel like very compelled to tell you that that would be very specific to the Mickey Mouse in Steamboat Willie. There's been lots of iterations of Mickey Mouse since then that are trademarked and copyrighted. So, you know, if it does fall into the public domain, please still be careful, because Disney is very serious about holding on to those exclusive rights that they have for their content. So anyway, that's a long story just to say that it's very interesting, the landscape of how we ended up with these copyright terms. So when stuff falls into the public domain, these would be creative works that are no longer subject to copyright. So if it falls out of the copyright term because of the length of time, then that's one way it can end up in the public domain. It can also be in the public domain if the content creator says from the get-go, hey, I'm not going to hold on to any of my exclusive rights. What's mine is yours. It's in the public domain. So there's different ways that things can fall into the public domain, and you can pretty much do just about anything you want with that content. It depends on the particular country that you're in, but in the United States, you can pretty much do whatever you want to with public domain content. And because of that term life of copyright, there hasn't really been an opportunity in the past 20 years for things to fall into the public domain. But on January 1st of 2019, there was finally an opportunity for content to kind of break out of that copyright time and fall into the public domain and therefore be available to everyone. And so this was just a screenshot of an article that talks about that. And one of the poems by Robert Frost, Stop in My Woods on a Snowy Evening, is now in the public domain. And so I've got the logo down here in the bottom of the slide, but I also have the full text of the poem on here. And I'm not breaking copyright. This is not copyright infringement, because now this poem is in the public domain. So I like to joke that, you know, a quote from this or some words from this song is probably coming soon to a coffee mug near you, or a t-shirt, because now you have the right to take the content of that poem and do really whatever you want to with it, even creating commercial products. So you might find a coffee mug out there with the text of that poem. There are lots of other places where content is in the public domain, and sometimes that's driven simply because of who created the content. So any content that's created by United States government agencies is really required to be released into the public domain. So for example, NASA If you go to the NASA website and find some instructional materials, that content is actually in the public domain, so you can use it how you want to without asking for permission. Places like here, I've linked to the Met and then the Smithsonian Open Access that just came out in February, has millions and millions of resources that now are clearly labeled as being in the public domain, and you can actually do whatever you want to with that content. So if you're looking for instructional materials and you're worried about copyright and whether or not you have the right to use that, be looking for things that are in the public domain, either because they've been around long enough to be in the public domain or because organizations have licensed them as such. Okay. So now we want to put on like this education hat and say, what does copyright look like through the lens of education? And there's a few things that educators are kind of given some of their own exclusive rights, if you will, to copyrighted content. And so I've linked here, and we're not going to dig into the links, but I wanted to have those there for your reference for later. But basically, there's a few things actually we're going to talk about. One being that Section 110 of copyright law allows for certain performances and displays, including face-to-face instruction. So this is that kind of area of copyright law where, as a classroom teacher in the classroom in front of my students, I have the right to perform and display copyrighted materials. Now, of course, we live in the land of digital now, and especially as we're transitioning to remote learning opportunities, that's a whole different ballgame. So we'll talk about that in a second. This next bullet about fair use, I'm sure is probably something you've heard many times. This falls into Section 107 of copyright law, and it says that there are certain instances where copyrighted content, at least to a certain degree, can be used in certain ways without permission from the copyright holder. And we're going to dig into fair use pretty deeply here in just a couple minutes. So I'll just leave that as it is for right now, knowing that we're going to dig deeper soon. And then the last bullet on here is the TEACH Act. So in early 2000s, there was an addition to copyright law that said, okay, as we're transitioning and there's more opportunities for digital learning, for virtual learning experiences, we need to recognize that there needs to be opportunities for educators to use content in a virtual educational landscape. Now, that is not just a kind of a blanket permission to say, hey, I'm a teacher and I'm teaching online, so I can do whatever I want to with copyrighted content. It's not that simple. There's kind of a checklist of things you have to do, and we'll talk about those in a little while as well. So this is just kind of the overview slide to give you some ideas of how copyright and education meet. All right, so now we're going to talk about fair use. And we talk about fair use, there's this 4-factor test, and you've probably heard of this before, and hopefully you've used this in decisions when you're thinking about whether or not you have the right under fair use to use copyrighted content. These are the 4 factors that I've listed here, and we're going to look at each one individually. So I'm going to, we'll dig into what each of these mean in just a second. But I want to just highlight a few things that, that may be concerning for teachers. And one of those is simply, where's the line in the sand? Like, can I just say, yep, these things are fair use and these things are not? Well, no, you can't. And that's ultimately why I think a lot of teachers say, ugh, this is too difficult. Why am I always having to weigh the pros and cons and really identify the risks of using copyrighted content? And what I hope you take away from today is that knowledge is power, because the lack of those clearly defined lines should not stop you from exercising your right to using content for fair use. And so when we go through the 4 factors in just a minute, I want you to think about a few of these key points here. And one is that ultimately you may make a judgment call. Well, you'll have to make a judgment call on whether or not something is fair use. But at the end of the day, the only person who really gets to make that final call is a judge. And if you make it in front of the judge, then that means somebody has has pushed for copyright infringement or sued for copyright infringement, and so we don't want to end up there. But ultimately, there's some subjective pieces to this, so that the fact that there's not a clear line means that it's going to end up being in front of a judge before somebody can make the final call that yes, this was fair use, or no, it wasn't. So it's really important that we consider all the factors. There's 4 factors, we're going to talk about them, and you really have to keep all 4 in your mind when you're deciding if something is fair use. And one of the things that I think we struggle with as educators is that when we dig into the first fair use factor, you'll hear me say that one of the key components of advocating, or not advocating, but for identifying if something is fair use is if it's something that's used for educational purposes. But I think a lot of educators kind of hang their hat on that. And not all educational uses could be considered fair use. So again, we got to talk about all 4 factors together. So don't encourage your teachers to hang their hat on just educational use equals fair use. Now, again, don't let this scare you, and I encourage you to help your colleagues understand that this shouldn't scare you away from fair use. It's really about knowledge is power, and I think it's actually a good thing that there's no clear yes or no answers, because it's not black and white. There are opportunities in certain contextual situations where something might be fair use in this scenario, but not in this one, and I think that that's a great thing, because it's not black and white all of the time. There's certainly some opportunities for things to be fair use depending on the context. Okay, so in the next few slides, I have some bulleted lists for each factor. And so how I've identified them is with like a plus sign, means it's more likely to be considered fair use if it went in front of a judge. And then the minus sign is that it's less likely. So that's kind of your primer for the next few slides. All right, so the very first one, purpose and character of use. That very first bullet, that it's a nonprofit educational purpose, that is a good thing. I mean, that's definitely a positive fair use argument for purpose. But another key piece to that is that it really needs to be transformative in some way. So adding new expression, new meaning, or new message, adding a different function from the original work. In other words, I'm not substituting what I've done with that content for the original work. It's kind of its own entity. I've transformed it in such a way that it kind of lives on its own because I've added new expression to it. Those are arguments for fair use. And you notice in that in the last plus sign bullet here that things like criticism, adding comment or commenting, news reporting, scholarship, things that are specific to research and scholarship, educational purposes, and even parody are things that fall under fair use of copyrighted content. What we've got to be careful about then in these last 2 bullets is that we're not just taking that content and substituting it in a new mode of presentation. So in other words, I can't take a novel and make it an ebook or an audiobook and say, well, it was for educational purposes. So, and I added new expression to it or new meaning, it's a different function. That's not necessarily going to be seen as fair use. And certainly, we don't want like verbatim copies, because again, that's not transformative. So when we talk about purpose and character, again, don't hang your hat on, well, it's educational, so I'm good. It's not quite that simple, and you've got to take all of the other factors into play, but certainly nonprofit educational purpose and transformative works are going to certainly lean more towards fair use than away from it. All right, the second factor, nature of the copyrighted work. And this slide's pretty simple, but the short of it is, if we're talking about copyrighted work that is that is nonfiction. You know, we talked about the fact that you can't copyright facts. So certainly nonfiction content would be more apt to be labeled fair use, because it's probably factual information that you could certainly transform and add meaning and translation to. But when we talk about fiction and even works that are not published yet, we certainly could fall out of that fair use landscape. So this one, I think, will, as we're talking today about some specific scenarios, I think putting this in connection with the other three factors is pretty key, because we're talking about what was the original intent of that copyrighted work. And Heather, I see your question about reading a children's book aloud in a recording. We are definitely, that's like a key scenario that we're going to talk about today. So we'll definitely hit on that. That's a great question, especially in the land of remote learning right now. So the third one has two pieces to it. This is about the amount of the work that you're using, and how, like, the substantiality of it. So this isn't just about looking at, you know, am I using only 30 seconds of the music clip? Am I only using one chapter or 10% of the book? It's not that simple. What you really have to think about is the greater amount that I use of the work, the less likely it's going to be considered fair use. And that's kind of common sense if you think about it. The more of the content I use of that work, the less likely it's going to be considered fair use. The other piece of this, that substantiality piece, is really important. And I think when we talk about the children's book, the read aloud, I think this is something we got to think about, is if the heart or the essence of the work is used, it doesn't matter about the percentage of it, but the heart of the work is used, then that's less likely to be considered fair use. So for example, if I have an image and you say, well, you know, this photographer's got 4,000 images, I just used one of them. Yeah, but in that one image, if I copied that image and used it without asking for permission, I really did take the heart or the essence of that piece of work. I used the whole thing, and it was kind of obviously the whole thing means I definitely used the essence of it. So we got to consider the work itself and how much you're using, and whether or not that's substantiated enough to be considered kind of the heart of the work. Now, the plus sign here is interesting, because I put that you can copy an entire piece of work if a few things apply to that. One, that you kind of have to use it in order to make a transformative use. You kind of have to use the whole thing. And it's not substituting for the original. So it's definitely a tricky space. There is no, I remember when I was a new teacher a long time ago, there was information about, you can use 10% of something, or you could use one chapter without getting permission. And it's really not that clear cut in terms of percentages and amount. It's really about, and you see this last bullet here, that more recently courts have said they've really been focused on how much of the work has been made available to the public. And that is going to be a key piece, especially when we talk about read alouds. Okay, so the last of the four factors is this effect on the potential market. And this is kind of tricky. And you notice I don't have any plus signs on this one. This one is really about how are you potentially affecting the market for that copyright owner. So if I'm widely distributing something, like to multiple classes, or even online, it's real easy to distribute something to like the general public. All of that needs to be considered, because that could certainly have a negative effect on the potential market for someone who's trying to make money off of their creations. So a couple other things to consider. If it appeals to the same audience as the original work, then you potentially could be making a negative effect on the market. and using that content over and over again. So maybe I don't just use it in this year's classes, but I use it for years to come. That's definitely going to err on not fair use because of the effect on the potential market. So I see some questions coming in, and I think, let's see, copying from a textbook, and what are some alternatives for read alouds. I think I believe I'm going to be answering those questions for you in the next few slides as we think about putting these 4 factors to work. So hold me to it, but I think I'm going to answer your questions for you. We're not going to dig too deep into this because we're already 34 minutes into our session here, but I do want to mention that Teach Act again. There are some very specific criteria you have to follow. And you see here, it's not just as simple as saying, well, I'm teaching online, therefore I have the right to put copyrighted content. You got to make sure that you're only limiting that content to enrolled students, that you have copyright policies shared, that you don't just put it behind a password, that there's more authentication to it than that. So there's quite a few pieces to the Teach Act that don't, I don't want you to hang your hat on this as your remote learning, remote learning copyright use, what am I trying to say? Reasoning, if you will. Okay, this doesn't validate that. You really have a lot of criteria you have to follow. And then let's throw in another little wrench into the mix here. When we talk about licenses, like for example, Netflix or subscription-based content like that, where I'm not purchasing content, but instead I'm agreeing to some terms of use, that's a little bit trickier than just saying, well, I have fair use rights to use this. This is a really tricky space because, and I just pulled this screenshot of a quote that I found from a court case that said, basically, parties can contract away fair use if the person has agreed to a freely negotiated license. So when you check that little checkbox that says, yes, I agree to the terms of use, you potentially are kind of giving away your fair use defense. So it's really important that, especially for digital content that we're accessing online, especially like subscription-based content, where you're accepting terms of use and a license really explicitly tells how you can use that content, don't assume that fair use is going to supersede that. Okay, and that's a tricky space. It's really tricky, and I really feel like it's diving into a part of copyright and fair use that's kind of taking away some exclusive rights of society, but currently that's the landscape we're in with digital and the fact that folks can have their own agreements to content. Okay, so here we go. This is the read aloud situation that I think a lot of folks, especially right now in remote learning time, are considering. So we're going to take a look at this and be ready, because I'm going to ask you to kind of share your thoughts in the chat. Here's the scenario. If you read aloud a children's book, and we're just going to say in this scenario, it's a fiction picture book, and you post that recording publicly on sites like YouTube or Facebook, and you're going to read that entire book and show all of the illustrations and the video, I want to look at each of the 4 factors for fair use, and I'm just going to ask you yes or no. Do you think it meets? Do you think it would fall into fair use or not? So let's look at the first factor, and this is just copies of the slides from earlier. So 1, in that scenario of the read aloud, where we're posting it publicly, you've recorded it, you've shown the whole thing and read the whole thing, do you think that it's falling under fair use for purpose and character of use? So just for this factor, would you say yes or no? And you can just kind of throw that into the chat. And I don't want to put you on the spot. This isn't a gotcha. This is definitely, this is a judgment call. So we're going to talk about why. Good question. Can we put this on a closed YouTube channel? That's a good question. I'm going to give you that scenario in just a second too. All right, so a lot of no's around here. There's a lot of folks that might say yes, especially if they just kind of hang their hat on that first bullet, nonprofit educational purpose, right? There are some folks that would even say that it is transformative because we're adding this new expression and this meaning to it by reading it aloud. I don't agree with that in this scenario, but I think a case could be made for it. And in fact, I'm going to show you some different interpretations of this specific scenario and fair use in just a minute. So some of the questions I see popping in on the chat are things like, you know, can I post it on a closed channel? We're going to talk about that. What if it's a live broadcast versus posting the recording? And, you know, again, I think it's going to depend on, like, for example, if I do a live broadcast on YouTube, the archived version of that video could also then be viewed. So I think it's going to, you know, you got to think about who has access to it and how long do they have access to, you know, is it really publicly available when you're thinking about the purpose and character, but also when we look at the other factors as well. So we're going to keep digging, and then we'll kind of come back and revisit some of these questions. Transformative, Hopper, that's a great question. Like, how do you explain transformative? Well, that's a great question because there's a lot of subjectivity to that definition. So again, I was saying that some folks argue that a read aloud is transformative because it's not substituting the original work. I'm adding new expression and meaning to it. But my argument is it's really more of a derivative because I'm reading it aloud. And yes, there's inflection in my voice, but it's really just an audio recording. And I'm sharing the full text with all the pictures. So it's a tough space. And I see folks saying, hey, what about this whole celebrity thing? There's celebrities out there reading aloud books online. You're exactly right. And in a lot of those types of instances, like some websites specifically, if you look at the terms of use or the policies on how they determine which books are going to be read aloud, you'll notice that it says we only read aloud books where we've been given permission from the author and publishing company. And then there's a lot of Facebook channels, YouTube channels out there that have read alouds that potentially are breaking copyright law. So just because it's out there, of course, doesn't mean that it's following the law. Okay, so let's Heather, I think we'll get to your question too. Like, what if it's really kind of behind a space where students can only access it because it's in a learning management system or something like that? So let's kind of dig through the rest of these, and then I think we'll hit on some of these questions again. So the second factor, nonfiction published is more apt to be fair use than fiction and non-published. So I'm gonna go ahead and answer this for the group because we said this was fiction, but it's published. So this one's kind of that gray area. The nature of the work is that it's it's a fiction, but it is published. So it's definitely a fair use factor to consider, but it's gotta be in connection with all the other factors. One of the other things I want you to think about with the nature of copyrighted work in this scenario is that this was a children's book. So the intent is that, I assume, is that the author wanted this work to be available for folks to be able to read this book and look at the illustrations, okay? So as we think about that through the lens of this next factor, I think it's important, the amount and the substantiality. So if we're reading the whole thing, would you say that I'm really gonna land under fair use or not? Give me a yes, no. I'm reading the whole book. Would you say I'm this particular factor is going to be fair use or not? Lots of no's, lots of no's. So this is, and I speak not just to the amount piece, but to the heart, right? If I'm reading the whole thing and showing you the whole thing, I don't think you can argue against the fact that it's kind of the heart of the essence of the work. So I think we're kind of in agreement on that one. This is a tricky one because some folks will say, hey, if I'm reading this book online, then I absolutely am making like a positive effect on the potential market, because authors, I'm like giving free advertising, but we don't get to make those decisions. We're talking about copyright owners who have the exclusive right to communicate and publicly display that content. So when we're putting this widely distributed work online to the general public, and we're using the whole thing, again, now we're putting all the factors together. Yeah, we're using it for educational purposes, but I'm also potentially really affecting the potential market for that content creator because it's so widely distributed. So my take on reading stories aloud online without getting specific permission from the content, from the copyright holders, is that it doesn't fall under fair use. Now I'm switching up the scenario a little bit here. Let's say we're not posting it publicly, but rather we're posting it somewhere like a learning management system like Canvas or Google Classroom or Seesaw, or somewhere where students in my class can only access it because there's a student ID or a password to get in. So if all of the other pieces of the scenario stay the same, do you think that I have a better chance of arguing fair use for this scenario than I do the previous scenario? Yes, I hope. Yes. Yes, if not using it year after year. That's a good point. Hopefully, yeah. This is that gray area, folks. And I mean, I hate to say it, there's no clear line here. But I think, I like your answer, Vicki. That's another thing we have to consider is this potentially, I think, would have a better case of fair use because I'm limiting it to the students in my class, just like it would be if I were reading this aloud in my classroom face-to-face. But if there's an opportunity where students could actually take that content from behind the password protected environment and share it out publicly, then that could get sticky as well. So I see a comment here, what if it was nonfiction? What if you delete it afterwards? This again comes back to considering all four factors, right? If it's a nonfiction book, then I have, if you recall from I'm scooting back here, from the nature of the copyrighted work, it's much more apt to be considered fair use, but this is just one factor. The other thing to consider with read alouds, we're talking about deleting it afterwards. That certainly, I think, would help make your case for fair use, but have you already made a negative effect on the potential market is something you have to consider. So it's a tricky space, guys, and I wish I could say it's a yes or no. Honestly, there's quite a few different interpretations of fair use when it comes to talking about read alouds online. And I've linked to a couple of them here. Some argue that it's transformative enough that it should be fine. Some say there's really not a market issue because it's free advertising. And some would even say that, especially given the circumstances currently, where the only way students have access to this content through remote learning is for me to get online and read it to them, then that would fall under fair use. I think we have to be careful about that because you've got to consider all four factors when you're making that decision. So I am going to be tuning into this webinar and I've linked to it in case you'd like to also join it next week. On the 31st, there's a webinar where we've got some experts who are advocating that fair use is translated to online learning and that read alouds are fair use. So Hannah, I see, thank you for sharing. There's a link that Hannah put in the chat of copyright exceptions, especially during this time. And that's what I want to talk about next. And whew, our hour is going by fast. So there are a few things, like for example, this came out, gosh, just a couple days ago. Audible has, through Amazon, has actually put on some audio recordings of books in different languages as well that are free to stream. So it's not, you're not breaking copyright because they are giving the right, they're giving permission for students to be able to actually access this content from any digital device. So that website is linked right here. That's one option for you. And of course, some of these things are coming out because of the situation. We've got a lot of organizations and companies who are coming up and saying, we want to help in this time of need. So this may not be something that lasts forever, but it says for as long as schools are closed, we're open. So certainly I think it's important for us to take advantage of those opportunities when they're available. This is another, and it might be similar to what you're talking about, Hannah, from Asheville City Schools. The school library media coordinators have put together this spreadsheet. And it talks about the different publishing companies who have currently said, hey, we're kind of relaxing our restrictions and giving permissions for certain things. So like, for example, Scholastic says, you know, we prefer that you do a read aloud in a closed group with limited access, but we know that may not be possible. So certainly you could put it on YouTube. But here's the deal. The agreement is that you delete your video or disable access by the end of the school year. And they encourage you to kind of share, you know, your read alouds with them. And so there are other publishing companies who have come out with the same thing or similar things where they're allowing you, at least for a certain length of time or with certain parameters, to do read alouds using their content. So I think that's, you know, I love that. I love that folks are stepping up. Now some, in fact, in that article, a couple articles in this slide right here, they argue that you don't even have to have permission because it falls under fair use. I tend to disagree with that because when I look at those 4 factors, I feel like I wouldn't have a fair argument for fair use. So I would personally lean on what some of these publishing companies have said they're willing to do to work with us during this time. The article is part of the PowerPoint. In fact, all of the links are embedded, so that particular spreadsheet is just linked to this image right here. All right, so a couple other things. Whew, we've got 10 minutes left. Bookshare, if you're not familiar with, is a website that provides an online library, and look at this, 800,000 ebooks, magazines, and newspapers in different types of formats for folks who have print disabilities. Because the law says that content that's copyrighted can be put into accessible formats for students with print disabilities. So this talks about how to help set up accounts for your students so that students who might have dyslexia or physical disabilities or are sight impaired or blind have access to materials. And that's not just during this time, although Bookshare does have a specific link about COVID-19 supports. So know that that exists, not just for right now, but all the time for students who have print disabilities. So know that that is an option if you're trying to find copyrighted content that's in accessible formats. Thank you for throwing the link up there. Yes, the presentation link is there. Didn't mean to click on that. All right. Okay, so let's talk about like a textbook. With anything, you're gonna have to think about those 4 factors. So if the 4 factors for a textbook, if I'm thinking about copying it, scanning it, printing it, you know, think about schools that are sending home printed packets that include pages from their textbooks, you've got to consider the 4 factors. How much are you using? I think we all agree, Wynn, that it's for educational purpose, right? But how, what was the intended purpose of the copyrighted material? How much of it am I using? And what's the effect on the potential market? And in some cases, you even have to think about what is our license with that textbook company for the use of that textbook content. So I can't just take a student workbook or the textbook itself and say, well, we bought it for a class set, so surely I can make a copy and send it home in their packet. That's not necessarily the case. And there's not kind of a health emergency amendment or addition to copyright law that says, well, in extenuating circumstances, you can do da-da-da-da. It's not that simple. So when you're thinking about making copies and scanning and printing and especially posting for public consumption, you really have to still consider those fair use factors, and also any potential license that you have with that company. Okay, this is an example. This is not to scare you, but again, the knowledge is power. In Houston, this was in the past year or so, in Houston, there were teachers who were taking this. I was even scared to put a screenshot of it on this slide, but it was a kind of a 2-page end of course, I think it was biology or something like that, end of course test study guide that a company had put together. Now, of course, it was probably mostly filled with facts. It's nonfiction, right? But the organization of it, the expression of it in this little 2-page brochure meant that this company could sell it. And if you notice, copying this material is strictly prohibited, is right there on the actual printed document. But in Houston, there were teachers who were actually covering over that statement and making copies for their students. So that school system ended up having to pay the company $9.2 million. So when we talk about this whole idea of fair use, you really have to consider the terms of use as well, because in this instance, the terms of use were pretty explicit. You can't copy it. And this school district blatantly did not follow that rule and ended up having to pay $9.2 million. So while I don't want to scare teachers, the true fact is copyright is a big deal, and copyright owners have the right to sue for copyright infringement. Oh my goodness, we've got 5 minutes left and I have so much left to say, but I do want to mention a couple things. Just because you cite copyrighted works does not mean, I'm good. I gave them credit, so, I didn't infringe on their copyright. That does not necessarily supersede their rights. So citations don't fix everything, okay? Certainly you want to cite something even if you're just using a fair use amount, but don't hang your hat on just a citation being enough. And disclaimers don't necessarily help your case. When I go to YouTube, I see videos all the time that say something to the effect of, I don't own the copyright to this work, or no copyright infringement intended. That's not good enough. You're still infringing on copyright when you're posting something that doesn't belong to you if it doesn't fall under fair use. Okay, so that, my friends, is kind of the down and dirty about copyright. What I want to briefly mention to you as we're kind of wrapping up here are specific to some other avenues that you can take that aren't about copyrighted material, but rather focus on things that have been given blanket permission to everyone to use in certain ways. And what I'm talking about is openly licensed content that allows you to change things, to do things like retain that stuff, remix it, revise it, redistribute it. And those of you who have been to any of my Go Open or OER sessions know this next content. When we talk about identifying what kind of content out there has been given permission, blanket permission to be used in certain ways, I'm thankful that companies like this nonprofit Creative Commons has come up with some logos and some language to help us understand how content creators want to share their stuff. So for example, on one of the very last slides in my presentation today, you're going to see this logo, this one in the top left corner that says CC BY. And that simply means, I'm going to scroll ahead here, that the only thing you have to do is give me credit if you use any of the content from my presentation today. All you have to do is give me credit. You don't have to ask for permission to use it in any way. You can post this presentation on your classroom website, on YouTube. You could totally remix it and take it apart and make it your own. The only thing I'm asking you to do is to give me credit. So when content creators are putting these licenses, these Creative Commons licenses on their work, they are saying, I'm willing to give up some of my exclusive rights and give blanket permissions to everyone. And the great thing about that is then you don't have to worry about whether or not this is fair use or not. So in situations like this, these different Creative Commons licenses, excuse me, I'm gonna skip ahead just a little bit. I can do things like, in this case, if someone puts this license on their work, I can use their content, but I can't do anything where I'm gonna be making money with the new stuff I make, okay? So that's an author, or that's a creator saying, hey, what's mine is yours, but you can't make money off of it, right? Another thing that's part of Creative Commons licensing is the share alike, which says, hey, if I'm going to share my stuff with you, then when you make new stuff, you need to share it too, like creative credit. That's right. That's right. And then no derivatives is a little bit less open, if you will. It's saying, use my stuff. You can post it online, you can make copies of it, whatever you want to do, but don't change the work. So that's a no derivatives clause. But there's lots of information out there. I'm skipping ahead since we're about a minute away. There's a lot of websites out there that have content that's already licensed to share. This is an image I uploaded to Flickr. And I'm saying, and use it however you want to. Make changes to it, crop it, change the colors, write over it, whatever you want to do. Just give me credit. So there's lots of websites out there where you can find content that is openly licensed. All right, there's lots of embedded links in here, but since we're literally out of time, I apologize. I'm going to skip all the way to some other resources. TED Talks, if you're familiar with the TED website, TED also has an educational website, and all of their videos are licensed under Creative Commons licenses. You can't make changes, but you can share that content however you want to. And there's lots of other websites out there like that, including a North Carolina website called Go Open NC. So if you're not familiar with this, you can access this through this link right here or through your NC EdCloud account. And this is a place where we are starting to grow a collection of resources that are openly licensed. And again, that's nice, because then you don't have to worry about whether or not it's fair use or if you're breaking copyright. If it's openly licensed, then you're going to see some permissions on there that tell you exactly how you can use that without having to ask the creator. And all of this is important because our competencies and our student standards talk about respecting the rights and understanding intellectual property. There's some additional resources I've linked here. Thank you guys so much. I hope this has been helpful to you. I'm sorry we're a minute over. If you don't mind, please make sure you go to the session attendance and feedback link that's on the slide. And if you still need the presentation link, it is also at the very bottom of this slide. It is a presentation, like I said, that is CC BY, so feel free to take it and remix it. Let me know if you need an editable copy of this, and I'll be happy to send that to you. If you think of questions after the fact, feel free to email me. And thank you, everyone. Again, I hope this has been helpful, and stay safe and healthy. Keep your hands washed out there, and we'll talk soon. Thank you very much.
learning copyright. Learning remote learning.